to the subject of hard times. Hard times, we shall see, is God's formula for fruitfulness. We're going to be talking about good and bad things this morning, and it reminds me of the conversation that two friends were having. One day, Pete meets Joe, and they were talking, and Pete says, "Hey, Joe, did you hear about the guy that won $1 million?" And the guy said, "Hey, wow, that's good." And Joe said, "Well, maybe. He made instant enemies when he made $1 million, and he had to charter a plane and get out of there." And his buddy said, "Oh, well, that's good. At least he got away." And his friend said, "Well, on his way, on his trip, the plane blew up and crashed, and he went flying through the air and went through the roof of a barn into a haystack where there was a pitchfork in there." And Joe said, "Well, that's bad." And Pete said, "Well, no, he missed the pitchfork, and he got away." And I suppose you can look at everything in life two ways. You can look at it as either good or bad. And most of us have the, being human, we have the attitude, or I guess the tendency to look at the bad side, don't we? We really do. And I guess if we're to be honest with ourselves, there's a lot of bad that we can look at in life. And there's a lot of things that can discourage us. There's a lot of things that happen to us that simply is not pleasant. And there really is no study, there should be no study of the church and missions, which we are in the course of following, that should not deal with this subject of Christian suffering, because it is such a large part of our experience. And that's why I've chosen this morning to spend a little while with you in God's Word for the encouragement that we can see and some insights on how to handle hard times in our lives. Suffering takes various forms. Sometimes we suffer because other people choose to make us suffer. They don't like us, they don't like what we stand for, they give us a hard time. This can be either Christians or non-Christians. They can do this to us. It's a sad thing, but lots of times even Christians can choose to cause other Christians problems. Suffering can be external, that is, caused by the will and desires of other people. Sometimes suffering can be our choice. I think it ought to be our choice, in that we should be willing to take a stand for Jesus Christ and to commit our lives to Him and to follow Him. And if we make that choice, we will suffer. Suffering, however, many times is God's decision. Sometimes it is God that says, "I want you to go through this, and I want you to experience this. I want you to be sick. I want you to do that." Sometimes God makes us suffer because of the choices we make, in that we make the wrong choices, and He chastens us, and He rebukes us, and He chastises us. Suffering takes many different forms. We're going to see all of these demonstrated in the first few years of history recorded in the book of Acts of the early church this morning. But we want to also observe the positive side. Suffering is bad. If you want to look at it that way, suffering is bad. But there is a good side. And I believe that the Scriptures very plainly teach that fruitfulness is the positive side of suffering. There are two sides of the same issue. They're human experience, and we will experience both. Fruitfulness is defined in the Scripture in different ways. We won't take the time to look at these references, but I urge you to look them up for your own meditation and instruction. In Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 to 23, we find the fruits of the Spirit. Did I say suffering is defined different ways? I meant fruitfulness is defined different ways. There is some kind of fruit that God's Spirit makes to exude in our lives, just like fruit comes out from within a plant. Just It's something that God causes to happen. And fruit will happen in our lives. And those things that are described there in Galatians chapter 5, those familiar verses, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering. We're going to hear about that again this morning. Long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, self-control. Those things we are not born with. Those things God's Spirit works out in our lives, and we're going to see that He uses suffering to cause it to happen. Fruit is the result of trial. Another type of fruitfulness is, I don't know how really to define it. I suppose you could call it spiritual accomplishments or spiritual attainments or our bank account in heaven, our rewards, however you want to look at it. It is something that we are laying ahead because of the way we act and because of choices we make. Fruit is something, for instance, giving in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verses 6 and 10 is described as being a means to an end, which is fruitfulness. God will increase the fruits of your righteousness if you give. Dr. Clark was speaking about that last Sunday, and Paul, in writing to the Philippian Christians at Philippi, in Philippians chapter 4, verse 17, he prayed that God would increase their fruit because of their sacrificial giving to Him. Fruit should also be something that is the result of conversion in my life and in your life. If I am genuinely born again, the works that I perform as God's child are described as fruit. Jesus said, and He says, it's a fact of life that we can look at anybody that professes to be a teacher and a leader and even a follower of Jesus Christ, and He said, by their fruits you shall know them. Obviously, He wasn't looking at merely something unseen. He was talking about visible evidence there. Fruit is visible evidence, works that we perform. In Romans chapter 1 verse 13, we find the words of Paul when he introduced himself to the Christians at Rome in that letter. And he says, I desire to come to you that I might have some spiritual fruit among you. I believe by that he was referring to the fact of changed lives. That is one evidence of fruit. That is one sort of fruitfulness. The fact that if I witness and minister, if you open your mouth, if you will share, if you will minister to the needs of those around you, the change that it brings in their lives is a form of spiritual fruit. Paul looked at it that way. In Hebrews chapter 13 verse 15, it talks about the fruit of praise out of our lips. See, fruit can take many different forms, and lots of times we don't really understand this. We don't see that God gains the glory in a multitude of ways through our experience as God's people. And we're going to see that suffering takes a variety of forms, and that these two realities of human experience mesh together into one. And that fruit of all sorts results from suffering of all kinds. It's God's will that we suffer. Take a look at the apostles. Only one of the apostles died a natural death. The rest of them were martyred. Look around us here this morning and look back over your own human history of X number of years. And look at the people that are not here this morning, and how many of us have physical trials. How many of us are suffering physically because of our frailties, our weaknesses, just the way we are. We live in a breaking down world. That is a form of suffering that God will do something great in our lives through in many cases. All right. So this morning I just wanted to bring this up by way of introduction. The simple fact of the matter is that we suffer, and the other fact, the other side of the coin, is that God causes us to bring forth fruit. He causes fruit to occur in our lives Himself when there is suffering. I want to look at two things this morning. I said we'll get through the book of Acts. We'll turn there eventually, but let's just first establish four things. Number one, that we want to look at the doctrine, basically. The doctrine is that fruit bearing often depends on suffering. Jesus taught this, Paul taught it, John taught it, others. Remember what James said in James chapter 1? He says, well, maybe we should turn to just a few of these references. James chapter 1, verses 2 and following, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience, but let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, lacking nothing." Verse 12, "Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to them that love him." There is blessing in trial. The specific sort of trial is not defined here, but it's a simple fact that these people were being persecuted. Romans chapter 5, verse 3, Paul says that tribulation worketh patience. Patience, experience. Experience gives us hope. The experiences of life, which are negative experiences many times, can give us a positive outlook on life. That's exactly opposite to the way this world views life. If you get in a bad accident, if you lose your health, if you lose your wealth, if you lose your friends and your family and all your possessions, you're finished. You might as well commit suicide. As far as this world's values go, I mean, what else are you living for? They don't tell you that there's anything else. Right? If you lose those things, you're finished. But the Christian's hope extends much further. Right? So, Romans chapter 5, verse 3. James chapter 1. Hebrews chapter 12, we'll not turn there, but it says that those of God's children who are genuinely His children cannot escape the chastening and the rebuking hand of God in their lives. Did you know that? That if you are a Christian, like me, some of the things that occur in your life are going to be directly attributable to the hand of God correcting you and correcting me. Now, I may not be able to say, well, I know that God is chastening him because of his sin. I can't make that decision. Only God knows, and you. See. But you can guarantee that it happens, because if you're a child of God, He disciplines His children. Hebrews chapter 12, read it for yourself. The end result, for those who are exercised thereby, it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness. God's hand of chastening produces fruit in our lives. In John chapter 15, verse 2, Jesus said that except a man abide in me, he cannot bring forth fruit. And it says those that do bear fruit, notice this carefully. Jesus said, and He was speaking directly to His disciples, He said, him that beareth fruit, the vine dresser, the Father purges that person that it might bring forth more fruit. If you're working and living for the Lord, cheer up. The Lord's going to send you trials. He's going to purge your experience. He's going to purge you as one of His children. Why? So that you can be a greater fruit bearer. He's never satisfied with any level that we attain. He wants us to increase and grow and advance. And He specifically says that more fruit is the result of the purging action. Of course, Jesus went on in John chapter 15 to describe the process. It's like we do every year. We prune our trees, or we're supposed to prune our trees, and we prune our raspberries, and we prune this and we prune that. We cut it off. God cuts things out of our lives, and it's usually a painful process. It's hard for us to get rid of things in our lives that we are still constantly doing. And when He cuts those things out, we bear more fruit. That is the principle. John chapter 12, verse 24, Jesus said, except a seed fall into the ground and die, it abides by itself. But if it dies, it no longer remains by itself, but it brings forth more fruit. It bringeth forth more fruit. I believe that because Jesus right then at that moment in John chapter 12 was talking about discipleship, I believe that that's going to have an application to another kind of suffering that we're going to see exemplified in the book of Acts this morning. So let's keep these types of suffering distinct in our minds. Let's recognize some trials are external because of the choices of others. Some trials are God's choice. He sends us the experiences of life, the traumas and the tragedies and the sickness and the sorrow. He is sovereign and He knows what He wants to do with our lives for our benefit. Another sort of suffering is because of our bad choices, that when we make a mistake, we're going to suffer for our sin. You know, the principle that Paul laid down in Galatians chapter 6 holds true, that you reap what you sow. Right? Regardless of whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, you reap what you sow. And a fourth kind of suffering is something that is up to us too. It's our choice whether or not we want to dedicate our lives in service to the Lord. Now, having established those kinds of suffering, let's go to the book of Acts. Let's see for ourselves the evidence in the lives of Christians. There's no question that these people were God's own people. There's no question that His Spirit was bringing them stage by stage through these experiences, because it's recorded in the Word of God. They are defined for us in biblical terms as disciples or Christians or brethren. And so we can see it for ourselves with our own eyes that the same fact holds true. Trial produces fruit. Let's look for a few minutes at external trials. This is where most of the examples in the book of Acts are found. There are about 30-some specific cases of persecution recorded in the book of Acts. There are specifically about 30-some cases of persecution, that is, suffering of Christians that they experienced because other people chose to beat them up or to persecute them or to blast them or whatever. Other people made the choice. The Christians suffered. What was the result? Let's see it for ourselves. Acts chapter 4, verse 3. Peter and John were just doing what the Lord asked them to do. It says in verse 1, they spoke unto the people, and as they spoke, the authorities came. Grabbed them. It says they were grieved. That is just another word for being very upset. And it says they laid hands on them. Again, we're not told exactly how it was, but you can conjure up in your mind any picture you want, right? I don't think it was probably, would you please come with me? Right? They laid hands on them and put them in custody. That's bad. Nobody wants to go to jail. I've never been there yet. I hope I never do. But many Christians have. It's just a simple fact. You know, down through church history, you can read Fox's Book of Martyrs, written in the 1500s by a man by the name of Fox, that had researched the sufferings of Christians since the days of early Christianity up through the 15th century, the 16th century, his time in England. He lived in a time of horrible persecution of Christians by the Catholic monarchs in England. Hundreds and thousands were burnt at the stake, had their heads cut off and stuck on poles on the edge of buildings and in the parks, sliced up with halyards, swords. You know, it was gruesome. You read the history in the 16th century of the Christians in Scotland. It's phenomenal, you know, what those people went through because they were Christians. John. John Bunyan wrote Pilgrim's Progress. Some of you may have seen the film. but it's based upon a book that he wrote. It's a Christian allegory written in the 1500s by a man of God. He was a Puritan. He was a simple man. He was a tinker by trade. I'll let you figure out what a tinker is by trade. And he was just a simple preacher of the gospel. And this man spent 14 years of his life in jail. And that's where he wrote Pilgrim's Progress. Pilgrim's Progress, not regress. And you can see why it became such a famous book. God has always had his people that have suffered. And it starts here with Peter and John, for instance. They ended up in jail. What for? Just for preaching. What was the result? Well, you can read through it, all these verses, down to verse 20. One good thing out of this, it was bad that they ended up in jail. It was good that they got a real good opportunity to preach to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of Israel, if you wish. That's what the Sanhedrin was. These men got to stand before the most important people in the country and say, Jesus Christ died for your sins, was buried, was rose again. That's the only way to be saved. It's not every day you get a chance to talk to the Supreme Court and witness to them about Jesus Christ. And that's what happened. In chapter 4, verse 21, so, when they had further threatened them, they let them go, finding nothing how they might punish them because of the people. Note carefully this seemingly insignificant statement. For all men glorified God for that which was done. Is that good or bad? I think it's good. The end result of these two men being put in jail for preaching was that everybody glorified the Lord. Now, I know it's easy for us to say, why in the world does this have to happen? Blankety blank, I wish God had not done this and that, and we can lose our cool. John and Peter didn't here. Look at chapter 5, verses 17 and 18. Then the high priest rose up, and all that were with him, which is the sect of the Sadducees, and were filled with indignation, and they laid their hands on the apostles. There you have it again. I know the Bible's little bald statements don't tell us all about the intrigue. You know, how many streets through Jerusalem did these guys run before they were apprehended? Under what circumstances were they apprehended? You can make a fascinating biography on what happened. All it says is they laid their hands on them and put them in the common prison. All of them this time. All the leaders. That's bad. All the church leaders are gone. The people are without leadership. That's bad. They're in jail. Ooh, what are people going to think about the leaders? That's bad. What was the result? For the second time, in a matter of weeks, the highest court of the land got a bold witness, this time from all the church leaders. They hauled them up on charges, and at this time they all preached at him. It says in verse 29, then Peter and the other apostles answered. And boy, they let him have it. And they give him the gospel straight. Chapter 5, verses 41 and 42. What effect was this on the apostles? They departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were accounted worthy to suffer shame for his name, and daily in the temple and in every house they ceased not to teach and preach Jesus Christ. These guys were thrown in jail. It ruined their career. Their social standing was kaput. That's bad. The good thing is that it did something for these men that revolutionized their ministry. And if I ever end up in jail, I'll tell you, there's going to be a different kind of Steve Clark comes out at the end, I hope. I hope it comes out like these guys came out. You know, Peter kind of gives us an intimation of this in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1, that they that have suffered in the flesh have ceased from sin, he says. He says it's just, there's a quirk of human character that God has built into us, that when we suffer for something, it does something to us. It'll either make us or break us. And in this case, it made them. And they were powerhouses for God. They came out of there and they never stopped. They never stopped. That's good. Not bad. You see? They ended up in jail. That was the first step in a long train of events that was just wonderful in its final result. Chapter 6, verses 9 to 14, we have the account of Stephen, one of the 7 men that was chosen to aid the apostles in the ministry in the Jerusalem church. And it says that he was hauled up on false charges in verse 11. It says they suborned men. They falsely charged him. And they brought him to the council, again, to this highest court of the land, and again, for the third time in a few weeks, these people heard the gospel plain and simple. You know, God gave them a number of chances. And Stephen gave one of the longest sermons recorded in the book of Acts, the whole of chapter 7. He got down to the end, and it made them so mad they were foaming at the mouth. Now, these were the leaders of the country, the jurists, great respect. And they were cut to the heart, verse 57. They gnashed on him with their teeth. You can just see these goons. What was the end result of Stephen's death? We're not told. It doesn't tell us that because Stephen died, millions of people became saved. All I know is that there was a man watching that experience, that it probably had a profound psychological effect. This is supposition. Who was that man? Young Saul of Tarsus, who in his own right was a zealot for the Jewish religion. I don't think that was a mistake that Saul saw that happen. It wouldn't be if you were in the presence of somebody that died unjustly, willingly, joyfully, and said what Stephen said, do you think it would affect you? Even if you were the guy's enemy? I bet you Saul began to ask questions in his mind. Maybe there's really something to this. This guy is a Jew like me. He should know better than do something stupid like that. Why is he doing that? Question mark. We don't know what the end result was. But we know that if it was instrumental in changing the psychology or the thinking of Saul of Tarsus, it did result in thousands of people eventually coming to know Jesus Christ. In chapter 21, the reason I want to skip over to chapter 21 for a moment, verses 27 to 31, is because this fourth bad experience of persecution resulted in the fourth and the final witness to the Supreme Court of Israel that we have found in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 21, verses 27. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews who were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teaches everybody everywhere against the people and the law in this place. And further, he brought Greeks into the temple and has polluted this holy place." And so something bad happened to Paul, the apostle, at the end of his life. Years of service, and you'd think God made a mistake. Why would he allow such a valuable witness, an evangelist and missionary, to have his ministry cut short and end up in jail again? Well, how did Paul get out of that mess? If you read through on in chapter 21, you'll discover that Paul, number one, got a chance to meet the Roman guard. That in itself was one positive thing, because Paul wasn't any chicken. He'd talk to anybody. We read that in the book of Philippians, that he led many of the Praetorian Guard in Caesar's palace to Jesus Christ. Caesar's own guards. Well, it doesn't say that it doesn't explain to us everything that went on here. We just have a partial account. But I'm quite sure that these guys were impressed. Another result of Paul being seized was that he got to preach to the Jews. And it was a very impressive episode, because the Romans, when they intervened, they thought that Paul was somebody else. They thought that he was some jerk from the wilderness that was trying to draw the Jews from Jerusalem out into make them like a cult and to fight against the Romans. When they found out that he spoke Greek, they figured, wait, this guy can't be that guy, because that guy obviously wasn't skilled that way. And furthermore, when he spoke to the Jews, he switched over into Hebrew. I imagine that impressed them. It impressed the Jews, and he had a profound sermon to preach to them. Of course, it made them mad too. Ultimately, he got to stand up in the high court of Israel again and gave a fourth and final witness to the Sanhedrin. Now, you say these are bad, aren't they? Yes, they're bad. And they're good, aren't they? Yes, they're good. It's just wonderful to see how God uses bad experiences, external persecution, to fulfill His will. Going back to chapter 8, verse 1, we'll look at one final reference to persecution in the book. And I would encourage you, just now that I've got you started, to pursue this through. Read through the book of Acts and see, every time something bad happens, what was the end result? And you will be surprised. It says, at chapter 8, verse 1, at that time there was a great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem. And they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. That's bad. Houses being split apart, people losing their property, homes being wrecked, people losing their employment, all kinds of havoc being wrought. Like a modern-day refugee situation. That's bad. The end result was, verse 4, therefore they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word. Bad or good? You know the thing that made Christianity what it was? Persecution. Remember what Jesus had told his apostles, his followers? Just before he went back to heaven, you shall be witnesses unto me in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the world. And he was just giving them a little kick. Now go. He was opening the door. The door was through persecution. And because of a result of this, the church was established in Antioch. Paul eventually left. The apostles all scattered eventually. Thousands of people came to know Jesus Christ. We spent all our time on this one aspect of suffering this morning. That external suffering, that is, persecution and opposition, and we've only looked at 5 or 6 examples in the book of Acts, inevitably leads to the glory of God. If it isn't so, these are only legends. But since they're history and truth, we can bank on it that when bad things happen to us, because of the choices of other people, God is going to do something good out of it. We could also look at the ordinary trials that we all experience. When I was just a kid, I was getting literature from Back to the Bible broadcast. And the music director of that institution, based in Lincoln, Nebraska, was named Eugene Clark. Over the years, that man has become a complete and total invalid, confined to bed through crippling arthritis. Now this man was dedicated to the Lord, he was serving the Lord full time, and he became a cripple. The only thing he can use is his mouth and his mind. And I've got a book of poems and music that man has dictated, word for word and musical note for musical note, out of his head, of praise and worship and instruction that is just, it'll bring tears to your eyes if you read it and meditate upon it. That man is bearing fruit regardless of his suffering. And you can go look at the example of Dorcas. This woman helped the widows. It was a disaster when she got sick and died. Read what happened. The threat of famine in Palestine. It had a positive result on the Christians at Antioch. One fella, I hope we don't have any Eutychuses here this morning, one fella fell asleep in Paul's long-winded sermon, and he died. There was a positive result of that very bad experience. Paul himself went through all kinds of physical needs, deprivation, without enough food and clothes and places to stay. And there was an end result evidenced in what he said in Acts chapter 20. He was able to use that. God was able to use that in his life for a positive end. Paul went through all kinds of danger. He went through a hurricane. Positive results ensued. So there is persecution from without, suffering that other people cause. There is suffering that is attributable only to God, whether it be health problems or traumas of daily life. God chooses those things, and they always have a positive effect. What about suffering for our sin? There's only 1 or 2 examples in the book of Acts of Christians that suffered for their sin. That familiar story in Acts chapter 5 of Ananias and Sapphira. They deliberately lied. The end result is recorded in the 11th verse of the 5th chapter. You read it. There was a tremendous positive effect on the Jerusalem church because of the sin of those two Christians. It was no accident. Paul chose to suffer, a fourth kind of suffering. And as a result of the fact that he deliberately chose to go to Jerusalem where he knew that bondage awaited him, he didn't know how it was going to happen, but he knew. God had warned him a half dozen times that he was going to suffer when he got to Jerusalem. He deliberately chose, and it was a sorrowful meeting at Ephesus when he left. Deliberate choice, suffering. Do you think it's an easy thing for parents or for Christian people who have children to leave their mums and their dads, their grandmothers and their grandfathers, their home church, and go to another country to witness for Jesus Christ? Do you think it's an easy thing? There's suffering involved in a choice like that. And the suffering is directly attributable to the choice of the person that's experiencing the suffering. The end result is positive. If Paul hadn't made that choice, the kings of Samaria and Judea and Palestine would not have received a witness. If he had not made that choice to go, when God asked him to go, Caesar wouldn't have received a witness. God laid it out for this man. And we can be thankful for the accounts and the choices of suffering that are recorded in the early church. I want to conclude this morning by reminding you of a very familiar verse in Romans chapter 8. And it's precisely on the theme that we're dealing with. We know that all things work together for good to them that love God, and it's not just because we love Him, to them who are the called according to His purpose. You read 2 verses in front of that and you'll discover that Christians have infirmity. Sometimes we don't even know how to pray. It's that bad. All things work together for good. You read a few verses on to verse 37, 38 in Romans chapter 8. We are more than conquerors through Him that loved us against anybody that would attack us. See, you can't separate these two things out of Christian experience. We suffer many ways, and God brings forth all kinds of fruit. Whether it be leading other people to the Lord, whether it be just an opportunity to open our mouths, whether it be the Lord intervening and in miraculous ways that happen often. So be encouraged, Christian. If you're enduring suffering, you know who to blame. But it isn't necessarily going to be bad. Let's pray. Father, help us to look at life through the eye of faith, through the eye of knowledge of your word. Help us not to go through life trying to work out every circumstance so that we only have good. Help us be willing to make choices that you ask us to make. Help us to be faithful to responsibilities that we know will involve suffering of various sorts. Help us, Father, to take your promises to heart and to depend upon it that these things are for our good, for your glory. And we'll praise you, Father, because if we are patient, we will see your hand working